I'm speaking today with Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, who is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he is also the director of their Bioethics and American Democracy program. Dr. Kheriaty is also a senior scholar at the Brownstone Institute. He attended Notre Dame University for his undergraduate degree in philosophy and pre-med, and then he got his medical degree from Georgetown University. Dr. Kheriaty then went on into the world of psychiatry at University of California, Irvine, where he completed his residency, and then he became a member of the faculty at the UCI Medical School, in addition to undertaking his own clinical practice in psychiatry. He's widely published. He has a book out last year entitled The New Abnormal: The Rise of the Biomedical Security State, as well as a previous book about A Catholic Guide to Depression, and many articles, everything from the Wall Street Journal to many well-known journals and magazines and publications. He's also appeared on many television programs, news, interviews, and has also recently testified before Congress. So it's my joy today to be speaking with a good friend of the Abbey and a good personal friend, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. Thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this conversation for
Likewise.
Many weeks. So I think that it'd be interesting for our viewers and listeners to hear a little bit about first what happened to you a couple years ago at UCI.
So I had been a faculty member, a professor in the School of Medicine at UCI for 15 years. I transitioned from residency at UCI to being a faculty member and worked my way up the ranks. And by the time 2021 rolled around, I was doing about half my time in the Department of Psychiatry, teaching administrative work, supervising residents and medical students. And the other half of my time, I was directing the medical ethics program in the School of Medicine and at the hospital. So I chaired the ethics committee, did all the ethics consults in the hospital, taught the required ethics course to med students. And I helped the university develop policies that had ethical implications, not just actually UCI, but I was working for the Office of the President that oversees all 5 of the UC branch campuses that have hospitals: UCLA, UCSF, UCSD, and so forth. And when the pandemic hit, our work group was developing COVID-related policies, actually, and policies that had were publicly and ethically sensitive, like what to do if we ran out of ventilators, how do we triage scarce resources during a pandemic. Fortunately, we never got to the point where we had to invoke that policy. But when it came to the university's vaccine mandate policy, our working group that had developed all the other COVID policies was not consulted. And I found that very strange and puzzling because it was clear to me that of all the policies we developed during COVID, that was going to be the most publicly controversial and ethically sensitive. So to try to get a conversation going, which I was not really successful at doing, I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal in late 2021 arguing, the headline was, "University Vaccine Mandates Are Unethical." I focused on universities because they were the first institutions before businesses and the government and other institutions were mandating the COVID vaccine.
Grade schools or high schools even.
Exactly. It all began with universities, and University of California was one of the first ones out of the gate. So, I passed that around the working group in the Office of the President trying to, hey, can we talk about this? And was met with radio silence. And about a week after I published that piece, the university finalized their mandate, and I started seeing colleagues of mine getting fired. I started seeing nurses that had worked every day during the pandemic and that I had worked side by side with, for decades, getting summarily sacked. And I thought that was very unjust because I had come out publicly in the pages of the newspaper with an opinion on this. People at the university started reaching out to me. I was getting students reaching out to me saying, I'm not a religious person, so I can't in good conscience submit a religious exemption. To their credit, they were trying to be scrupulously honest. But I have moral or conscience-based objections, and there's no recourse for me to get out of, taking this vaccine or losing my position at the university. And I just started projecting ahead a few months to when I was going to teach the required ethics course to the medical students. And I was trying to imagine getting up in lecture 2 of that course and talking about the principle of informed consent, which these policies were clearly violating. Principle that goes all the way back to the Nuremberg Code following World War II, the code that was developed as an answer to the Nazi doctors' atrocities, experimenting on death camp prisoners without their consent. I was trying to imagine in lecture 6 where I talk about integrity and moral courage and, stepping out and doing the difficult thing as a medical student, even though you're at the bottom of the hospital hierarchy, there's powerful forces arrayed against you. Maybe if you report an attending physician who is doing something harmful to patients, but you still have to do it, right? You have to do the hard thing,
sure. And you're also
even when it's difficult.
And you're also building up, even as a medical student, the whole apparatus of the ethical system that you embody and know, so that you can apply it as your career unfolds, right? I mean,
exactly.
These are important things.
So given my position at the university as director of the ethics program, I just came to the point where I said, well, it's not enough for me to, state a public opinion criticizing this policy. If I am seeing students and colleagues at the university being harmed by this, and I'm in this position, I don't actually try to change the policy. I don't know that I could, in good conscience, stand up in front of medical students and encourage them to take action to try to prevent harmful things that they see. So I made sort of the fateful decision to challenge the university's vaccine mandate in federal court, filed a lawsuit, and if you want to go sideways with your employer very
That's a
quickly,
good way to do it. Yeah.
It's a good way to do that. Yeah, sue them in federal court. And the university acted very swiftly after that in firing me. Essentially, they placed me immediately on what they called investigatory leave, then a month later on unpaid suspension, and then a month later they fired me. So sort of ran me through the paces of how to get rid of a full professor as quickly as possible. So that decision, not surprisingly, I was aware that was a possible or even likely consequence of my lawsuit. Really changed my career trajectory. I had expected to retire at the university, just continued teaching there, and treating patients and working in the School of Medicine for the rest of my rest of my career.
Yes.
Didn't turn out that way. So I started a private practice here in Orange County, and I fortunately had a couple of independent think tanks, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Brownstone Institute, other places reached in and said, okay, we want to support your ongoing research and your ongoing work in public health and public policy. So I found a very hospitable new home at EPPC, which is a think tank in DC. I made a lot of new friends working in public policy and what's now come to be called the medical freedom movement, advocating for the right of informed consent, for transparency from our public health agencies, data transparency in scientific research. And now actually my focus has shifted this year to looking at the issue of government-sponsored censorship.
Yes.
Because the other thing that happened to me after I got fired was a lot of the work that I was doing, critiquing COVID policy, and the work of top-notch colleagues and friends of mine, Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, others, were being censored online. And at the time, we thought it was just the social media companies were doing the censorship. YouTube was removing our videos, or Twitter was deboosting our content.
Or even closing some accounts.
Yeah, kicking us off the platforms.
Right.
That's right. But what we learned more recently was that actually the social media companies were doing this at the behest of the federal government.
Yes.
And the Biden administration and senior officials in agencies ranging from the FBI to the CDC to the Surgeon General to the Department of Homeland Security to the Treasury Department. There's at least a dozen federal agencies that are involved in interfering with and pressuring social media companies.
Okay, I want to interrupt just for a second there, Aaron, because that's a whole, I think, a very important and sort of second area that we need to really explore in this conversation about what about the Missouri versus Biden case and how that career turn toward this advocacy on the political front to defend the First Amendment of our Constitution. That's sort of the fallout of the first chapter of your career transition, as it were, out of UCI medical school and hospital into this other corner of the public domain, right?
Yeah.
So, but I want to back that up for a second, just because I'm interested in so many things we could talk about. But first of all, just the observation that you said you weren't expecting that turn in your career like that, because you were planning to just do what you were doing in a job that you loved, work that you loved, and retiring in that. And because of your embracing of a fully integral Catholic conscientious stance in your place of work, that meant that the Lord invited you into a different career path. So your integrity, it seems to me, just an observation from a priest and a friend, is that your integrity, when you said there that you had a hard time imagining standing up in front of your ethics class, encouraging them to build up the apparatus of a medical ethical framework upon which to construct their career.
Right.
If you yourself were going to somehow compromise what you saw to be an ethical dilemma as a colleague, peer, professor in this place. So it seems to me that choice to remain faithful to this integral ethical framework in your own personal life is that would also then gave God the opportunity to say, okay, well, there's something else that I have in store for you, and it's over here. So that's just an observation. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. My other question is, what did that do to your family?
Yeah. So I'll answer both of those things. So as to the first, I think there were two things that gave me the strength to do what I did. And the first is my faith in God's providence, exactly as you described. I didn't really have a parachute or a plan B. All of this happened very quickly. Mm-hmm. The decision was made fairly quickly. I had to scramble after I was fired to join another private practice quickly so I could at least start seeing my patients. Mm-hmm. But I've since set up my own solo practice. But I didn't have any facility with the business side of medicine. The university had always taken care of my clinical practice for me. And I didn't also have a plan as to how to support the other work that I was doing, my ethics research, my public health and public policy work.
Your writing.
My writing.
Yes.
But I did have the sense that, just given the example of the great heroes of our faith, the saints, people like Thomas More, or Blessed Franz Jagerstatter, a great 20th century example of someone who followed his conscience in refusing to take the oath to Adolf Hitler and ended up, giving not just losing a job, which is small potatoes, but giving his life for the witness to the truth in that case. His story is depicted in Terrence Malick's film, A Hidden Life.
It's such a beautiful film.
Beautiful film.
Yes.
And so I had that to lean on. I had prayer in the sacraments and the conviction that I don't really know what's going to happen next or how all of this is going to work out or how I'm going to support my wife and
5 children,
5 boys, pay the tuition bills and so forth. But I had the sense that if I just tried to do the right thing according to my conscience, that God would sort things out. And he certainly did. I mean, people were so generous and various institutions were so generous in coming to my rescue and in giving me a home and a place in which to do my work.
Until you get back on your own feet again,
to get back on my own feet
financially
again.
and just institutionally and so forth.
Exactly. But the other piece that was so important was my wife, Jennifer, who really sort of, first of all, helped steady the children and sort of cushion the blow and uncertainty, but also helped me. There was a moment where it was getting to the point where it was clear I was going to be fired if I did not submit a religious exemption, which I could have done actually. And this is conjectural, but my guess is the university would have accepted it if I would have done that. The reason I didn't do that is that would have removed my standing to bring a lawsuit to actually try to change the policy. So rather than just trying to sort of save my own skin and save my own job, I had filed the lawsuit not primarily to take care of myself, but primarily for the university as a whole, because people with less power, people without the the support of the nonprofit group that was supporting the lawsuit, were again sort of losing their job, and nobody was paying attention. Nobody was telling their story.
That's really interesting, Aaron. I didn't know that. I didn't know that feature of that departure, or the fact that you had the out of a religious exemption at the university. I didn't know that, but that's very interesting, because what that indicates is that because God had put you in a position in the system itself, in that university system, that you were at a place as a professor, a full professor, and also teaching the classes, and also a physician and so forth, that you, unlike maybe probably most of the other employees of that institution who would not have the wherewithal to be able to file their own lawsuit and pursue some kind of a conscientious attempt to change policy or to let the truth win out, you were uniquely placed to be able to do that, and you saw that. So you had to say, well, I'm going to have to put my head on the chopping block here for the sake of all these other people, figuratively speaking, of course.
That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to change the policy and set a precedent in court that would push back against these unjust and, quite frankly, unscientific vaccine mandates. So I saw it as a defense of sound empirical science as well, because we knew the vaccines did not stop infection and transmission. Therefore, the risks and benefits of the vaccine accrued to the individual recipient. Therefore, the principle of informed consent needs to apply in these cases. Where there's risk, there has to be choice. But I also knew the science on natural immunity. I had recovered from COVID.
We had it at the same time, actually. I think we got it.
That's right.
We did at the same event. We caught it at the same super spreader event.
So I knew I had immunity that was more robust and long-lasting than the vaccine. So, for all these reasons, I didn't want to just take the religious exemption out, so to speak. I wanted to try to set a precedent in federal court that would help other people at the university and beyond the university who were dealing with unjust vaccine mandates.
In that realm, now we're looking back at this at the distance of a couple of years now, and do you think it worked? Do you think that there was, as far as you know, from the fallout over the last couple of years, did it work? That is your putting yourself on the line, losing your job, doing that in a public way, then all of the media attention that came along with it and the press.
I'd like to think that it contributed to the walking back of many unjust policies. Not all of them. The University of California still has a vaccine mandate, although they're not really enforcing it. And there's a lot more loopholes now. So people are no longer losing their jobs over this. And I think that's a positive development. Most of the vaccine mandates have been abandoned. And so I think I was an early critic of policies that are now widely regarded as misguided or misdirected. So that's a positive development. I wanted to mention just one other thing about my wife, Jennifer, because when I was wavering and I was thinking about how do I support my kids, and maybe I should just, submit a private religious exemption to opt out of this. And she never told me what to do, but to her credit, I remember her saying, I'm not going to tell you what to do in this regard, but a lot of people are now looking to your case, and a lot of people are now looking to you for guidance and hope on this particular issue. And I think you should strongly consider finishing what you started. And that's all I needed. It was her permission, her little nudge to say, no, it's okay. You can do this. We're going to be okay. God will take care of us. And, and for me, after that, the decision was easy. And I think without Jennifer's support, without, thanks be to God, trust in his providence, I don't know what I would have done. Let me just put it that way. I'm not sure I would have had the ability to do what I did. my case did not succeed in striking down the vaccine mandate. Unfortunately, the federal courts, for reasons that probably would take us too far afield to get into, are reluctant to set any limits on a very old 1905 case precedent called Jacobson v. Massachusetts that the courts have used, I think, over-applied to support vaccine mandates. But certainly public sentiment has turned against
Definitely.
that policy. Public sentiment has generally turned against other harmful pandemic policies like lockdowns and school closures and mask mandates and vaccine passports, all the things that I and my colleagues were critiquing in 2020, 2021. I think we're winning that argument.
Yes. So I think actually that's a great place for us to turn to the next chapter of this conversation too, because the fact that there has been, I think, in the last couple of years, this turn in public sentiment about those forced, imposed from the outside, especially from the government kind of procedures in that pandemic. Nevertheless, the fact that sentiment has changed, at least in my view, and probably in your view too, doesn't mean that we can't find ourselves in that same position again. Precisely because with this other chapter in your life now, more recently, the Missouri versus Biden case and the attempt to defend the First Amendment right to free speech against government incursion, even in public platforms like all of the social media platforms or whatever's happening online, that incursion to try to craft a narrative or stifle free dissent against that narrative is still very much something that we're living in. We're living in an atmosphere where that hasn't changed from that first wave of pandemic with all the policies, the very really authoritarian policies that went along with it. So that's where you find yourself now. And actually, that's, I think, what we can talk about for a few minutes now, too, if you're interested in that.
Absolutely.
So in other words, what's going to prevent us now from what's going to prevent us from repeating all of those authoritarian incursions into our freedoms?
That's a really important question, because even though the specific policies have been rolled back in most jurisdictions, the infrastructure that was put in place to make those policies possible is still very much in place. And I talk about all the different elements of that infrastructure, what I call the biomedical security state, in my book, The New Abnormal. So shameless plug there for the book.
It's really worth reading. I enjoyed it very much.
For those who want a deeper dive. But maybe for purposes of our conversation today, one key aspect of that infrastructure is what my friend, the journalist Michael Schellenberger, has called the censorship industrial complex. I usually refer to it as the censorship leviathan. This is a network of at least a dozen government agencies with a little-known agency called CISA, which I'll talk about in a moment, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, operating as a sort of central hub of the government censorship regime. In partnership with, I call them quasi-private entities, because they're actually publicly funded NGOs or government funded and sometimes government organized NGOs, places like the Stanford Internet Observatory, another outfit called Graphica, the Atlantic Council. These quasi-private entities are sort of the foot soldiers of the censorship regime. And they have thousands of people working 24/7 to flag posts on social media, to funnel through government connections to the social media companies, to basically get those accounts shut down, prevent those posts from going viral.
Right.
And so our Missouri v. Biden lawsuit is this two states, the State Attorney General of Missouri and Louisiana, along with 5 private plaintiffs, and I'm one of those private plaintiffs, have filed a suit claiming that the federal government is doing this, that they are pressuring and coercing social media companies to censor speech that contradicts the government, their preferred narratives and their preferred policies. And the 5 private plaintiffs were censored on COVID-related content, critiquing, the policies that we talked about a few minutes ago. But what we learned on discovery is that the government was also censoring all kinds of other things. So many Americans have heard about the government's censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which turned out to be true. The FBI was involved in that whole operation. But we now know that they were censoring critiques of foreign policy. So the State Department was censoring critiques of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, our support for the war in Ukraine. They were censoring, other agencies were censoring abortion-related content, gender ideology-related content. The Treasury Department
of all
was censoring critiques of our monetary policy. The Census Bureau was involved in censorship of election issues. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And basically what I came to is looking at the evidence that we presented to the court was take any contentious or debated sort of lightning rod issue in American public life. The federal government had its thumb on the scale and was forcing social media companies on threat of, removing Section 230 liability protections, which would basically cause the social media companies to collapse, the threat of breaking up their monopolies. The government has all kinds of really scary sticks that it can use.
Especially economic ones for companies like that.
Exactly. And the companies, one of the things that surprised us in this case is that we sort of assumed that in most cases, the companies would be sort of ideologically aligned with the current administration, and it would look very cooperative and maybe hard to prove coercion or significant encouragement, which is the legal criteria for violating the First Amendment on the part of the government. But it turns out that we have many, many instances of the social media companies actually trying to push back.
How about that? Wow.
And just getting worn down by relentless pressure over and over and over again,
Wow.
and by these coercive threats, or by promises of doing things to help the social media companies financially, that they finally caved in. And so the level of coercion is really astonishing. We actually don't, for purposes of proving our case that the government violated Americans' First Amendment free speech rights, we don't actually have to establish that overt coercion occurred. The legal bar is much lower, that anything that constitutes significant encouragement is also unconstitutional. Because if you read the First Amendment, the First Amendment says the government cannot abridge free speech.
Yes.
It cannot do anything to impair free speech. So even significant encouragement is unconstitutional. We've definitely established that, but we've also established the kind of overt, threatening, jawboning kind of pressure that makes the violations even more egregious. So, long story short, what's happened with that case, we got an injunction on July 4th against the government from District Court Judge Terry Dowdy, who, you like to think that stuff you're involved in is of, landmark or world historical importance. But the judge himself in this case said, if what the plaintiffs allege is true, and by granting our injunction against the government, he indicated, it looks like it's probably true, even before the case goes to trial. If what plaintiffs allege is true, this is the worst violation of free speech rights in American history. Government appealed to the circuit court, which came out with a ruling a couple weeks ago, upholding the core elements of the injunction and joining the White House, the CDC, the FBI, and the Surgeon General to stop communicating with social media companies in ways that would involve coercion or significant encouragement regarding content. So that was a major victory. Three-judge panel, unanimous. We have 4 federal judges now, all saying, yeah, there's a real serious problem here. This is a real issue, and an injunction is hard to get. You have to establish that you're likely to prevail on the merits, even before the case goes to trial. You have to establish that irreparable harm is going to happen if the government doesn't intervene right away, or if the court doesn't intervene right away and try to, put a stop to this. So it's a very high legal threshold. And the court, the district court and the appellate court both agreed that we had exceeded that threshold with preliminary evidence that we've submitted. So what's happened now is actually the government appealed again because they want to continue censoring Americans.
Right.
Apparently.
So they appealed to the Supreme
They
Court.
appealed to the Supreme Court. And the case is before the Supreme Court. There's a very good chance we could get a ruling today. So by the time this interview comes out, the Supreme Court may have spoken on this issue.
Yes.
And even if we don't get a favorable ruling on the injunction at the Supreme Court, I anticipate we will, but even if we don't, the case is not over. That just means now we proceed to the trial phase, where there's more discovery, where there's more evidence that we'll be able to obtain to prosecute our case.
So this is ongoing, and it will be ongoing for some time.
It will be, probably for a couple of years. Yes. The government's trying to stymie every step of the process. Yes. So it's a case that's going to take a long time.
Right.
Most observers believe the final ruling will also end up at the Supreme Court. But we've amassed so much evidence that I just don't think it's possible that we'll lose this case.
So it's a question now of the legal teams and everybody just persevering through to the end.
That's really. Right.
And the wherewithal for that's no small task in itself.
That's right. That's why we need prayers, and we need we need support, and we need to win in the court of public opinion as well. Sure. That's why conversations like this are important, because most Americans are not aware that this is happening. Most Americans get their news on social media, like 80%, from Facebook and Twitter and links that are provided to articles on those platforms. And most Americans don't realize that they themselves may have been subjected to censorship, because it's not always obvious that you're being censored. Sometimes they'll kick you off a platform or tell you your video has been removed from YouTube. But very often it's much more subtle algorithmic control.
Yes.
Where novelist Walter Kern, who's commented on these issues, has compared it to mixing a record. He said, when the government coerces social media companies to change their algorithms and their terms of service, which we have evidence that that's actually what's been happening. I may put something out there on Twitter, but my followers don't see it because it's quote unquote shadow banned. So somebody is sitting at, like a sound engineer sitting at this soundboard.
Raise that one up, quiet that story down.
A little more cowbell, little less snare drum.
That's great.
And basically, with those sorts of techniques, search results, prioritization, shadow banning, boosting and deboosting, you can prevent certain ideas from going viral and gaining an audience, and you can propagandize essentially other ideas by artificially boosting their visibility and their influence. And top-down information control online is the end result.
I have two observations about that. Let me know what you think about these. One is that of course there is the person or the idea who's actually being censored. There, this story or this opinion.
That's right.
There's that, but then there's also the collateral damage of that, which is not exactly censorship, but it is manipulation. That is all the people who would have seen that story or that idea, but don't receive it because the voice is being silenced, or shadow banned, or algorithmically deplatformed. But that's not the only victim of this kind of government overreach and infringement against the First Amendment. Then everybody else also is a victim, in the sense that whoever didn't see that story is not being presented with the information which might bring them to the truth. So
that's exactly right.
Which is precisely why we have the First Amendment to begin with.
Exactly. That's why this affects all Americans. Mm-hmm. So you may think, well, I'm not on social media, or I only go on social media to read things. I don't post things. So there's sort of two people that have been harmed. There's the American who's sitting on his back porch tweeting something about, I don't know about these voting machines, or, I don't like these,
this policy,
on this or that issue,
mandate or whatever it is, or mask mandate.
And his tweet disappears down the memory hole. Can't gain any traction. People don't actually see it. But there's also the person on the receiving end. The Supreme Court is very clear on this in their First Amendment jurisprudence, that not only is the speaker harmed when free speech rights are abridged, but the recipient of information is also harmed for exactly the reasons that you describe, because you get only one side of a debated topic, right? And you get the sense of a false scientific consensus on an issue that's actually very much debated within the scientific community, or a false political consensus on an issue in which reasonable Americans of goodwill have strong disagreements, and by controlling what information people can access, you essentially control their ability to reason clearly about issues of great public importance and to be able to pursue the truth by understanding both sides of debated issues.
Yes. It's just such an important thing that you're doing here, Aaron. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. So the other observation I have about all of this, in a way, all of everything we've been talking about so far, in a way, is kind of the preamble to the sort of
More important things.
So really, in a certain sense, and that's the religious import of all of this. Because I mean, we're having this conversation in a monastery, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
And why would we have this kind of a conversation about these important political, governmental, legal, ethical ideas? Why do we do that? Well, I think that, at least from my perspective as a priest and as a canon regular, we look upon the culture in a certain sense from the outside, even though we're in it. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. That's the tag for Christians, right? But even more so, a priest and religious, we can observe from an outsider's perspective in a certain sense. What I see happening is that all of these things we're talking about have deeply religious ramifications, serious spiritual ramifications, because, of course, as this, not just the infringement upon our rights, on our constitutional rights, but then there's a whole world, which we talk about all the time, of creeping secularism, materialism, all of these philosophical ideas underpinning the cultural wars that we're living in.
Yeah.
And we might think, well, that's just a-religious, or there's no religious import to that. In fact, by their own admission, secularism is decidedly against any kind of religious meaning.
That's right.
And yet, all of that has a sort of religious underpinning of its own, hidden from most thinkers or from most people looking at it. They say, "Oh no, that's just secularism. That has nothing to do with religion." But in fact, if whether a government or a policy, a public policy, or the approach to what does the truth mean in culture, those ideas are always somehow going to also be spiritual, aren't they?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, the question of whether we can pursue the truth is a question that is deeply religious, or you could say a philosophical question that is deeply important for religious truth claims. And what we have now is a situation in which the suppression of free speech substitutes the authority of the truth, which we need to be free to pursue and which we're capable of pursuing because all of us participate in the logos, which is clearly a Catholic idea, but it's also an idea you can trace back to Plato and some of the ancient philosophers, that all of us participate in a shared rationality, that the world is ordered and our mind is capable of knowing and discovering that ordered world. And Christians would understand that order to be the capital L logos, right?
The Word of God.
The Word of God, the second person of the Trinity, became incarnate in Christ. But even the ancient, the best among the ancient philosophers understood that we can participate in a shared rationality that allows us to deliberate and to debate and to inquire and to investigate. It's the whole basis of the natural sciences, and that needs to be respected in the other person so that we attempt to persuade and convince through rational persuasion and through witnessing to the truth by our lives and our actions, and not through the pure application of force, right? And what we have now is a situation in which various ideologies, and you could think of Marxism as a sort of paradigmatic example of this. Marx did not believe that we participate in a shared rationality. His materialism, his historicism said, no, ideas are just foam on the waves of underlying material forces or underlying social forces. You believe what you do because you're a white male American born, straight, whatever. All of these biological or social factors are the only determinants of what you think. And it's not to say that those don't influence what you think, but Marx said that's the only thing that influences what you think. So rationally deliberating with you as though we participated in some transcendent source of truth that we could come at in a joint venture, that makes no sense, right? So, if you're living in a communist society and you raise a question about the communist ideology, and you say, I don't know that the coming revolution is going to usher in a future utopia where the state is going to disappear. The Marxist doesn't argue with you. He just says, well, you're just infected with bourgeois consciousness.
Right.
You just believe
you need to be re-educated or eliminated.
Exactly. And the re-education is not a matter of persuasion. It's
That's
a matter
right.
of force. Like, we'll send you to the gulags, right?
Until you learn your lesson.
Until you learn your lesson. If that doesn't work, we'll eliminate you. And so totalitarian regimes always begin by monopolizing what counts as knowledge and rationality, and by deliberately obstructing reason, right? They're a carefully constructed system to prevent people from asking questions. So Eric Voegelin, who studied the 20th century totalitarians, described this in terms of, the central feature of totalitarian systems is not concentration camps or men in jackboots, or, secret police or mass surveillance, which we have some of that, by the way. We definitely have mass surveillance online, but the core feature of totalitarian systems is the prohibition of questions.
Right.
Circling back to that free speech issue,
because
right?
Because
you're not allowed to ask questions about the ideology.
The totalitarian state, at its best, if you want to call it that, is when you don't need the jackboots or the prison or the gulag.
Exactly.
It's when everybody, even in the family, everybody is informing on one another, because no one can ask the question that challenges, that suggests that there's a reason, a logos, a discourse outside of what we're being told.
That's exactly right. In the Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, the great Jewish philosopher, describes the difference between a dictatorship, which rules people through external fear, right? I don't want to be punished by the ruling regime.
So I'll toe the line.
But I can still have my own interior freedom in terms of my own interior thoughts. Whereas a perfectly realized totalitarian system, exactly as you just described, in the beginning is going to use external force. But as it becomes more and more perfectly realized, there's less and less need for the gulags and the concentration camps and the secret police, because everyone is surveilling everyone else to make sure that they fall in line with the ideology. And at the perfect endpoint of that, you're in an interior prison because the questions no longer occur to you.
That's right.
Right? You're in a prison with invisible bars, and you don't even realize that you've been imprisoned by this ideology, that the really important questions about the ideology and the questions about the religious dimension have simply disappeared without a trace. And this brings us back to the question of the effects on religion. The philosopher Augusto Del Noce, who died in 1989, another philosopher who studied 20th century totalitarian systems, distinguished between revealed religion and what he called the religious dimension. The religious dimension is the human questions to which revealed religion proposes answers, right? Questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Where did I come from, and where am I going?
Yes.
What is happiness? What constitutes the good life? And what he described in terms of the 20th century totalitarian movements was the erasure of not just religions, the kind of anti-clerical persecution of religion, characteristic of the Enlightenment atheists and characteristic of
the Spanish Civil War.
Exactly. That's definitely there, but in these perfectly realized totalitarian systems of Nazism, fascism, communism especially, there's the persecution of the religious dimension. There's the persecution of the questions to which revealed religion is the answer, right? And so revealed religion, what you and your conferers are doing here at a monastery, would simply make absolutely no sense to people who have become incapable of asking those deeper questions.
Right. If they're not asking the question about what does it mean to be happy, or what is the meaning of life, or what happens after I die, or something like that, this sort of a representative of the revealed religion then is just completely nonsensical. Because
Exactly.
I've never even asked the question, so why would I look for that answer?
Precisely. Precisely. And so, I mean, in a sense, the real challenge, I think, that people of faith, that Catholics have to deal with today is not, I mean, you still have some of these so-called new atheists who are arguing against the existence of God, sort of in the old Voltaire Enlightenment tradition, or there are the anti-clerical people that are complaining about, institutional religion and the church and this and that. But I think the real sort of bigger challenge is not an atheism that is arguing about the existence of God, because at least there, the new atheists are taking the question of God seriously.
That's right. They're asking the question.
They think the question is important.
Yes.
They think it's important to get it right. And they may be getting the wrong answer, but at least you can argue with them about whether God exists and whether it matters and so on and so forth. But with a kind of natural irreligion, where the religious question, the religious dimension disappears, people don't think the question of God even matters. It's a question that doesn't even occur to them. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of blasé agnosticism that, you could do your thing if you want to wear this white habit and, pray a lot if it makes you feel good or whatever, fine. But I'm not going to even stop and think about these questions to begin with, because they really don't matter for human life. God may or may not exist, but if he does, he's totally irrelevant, right? And I think that kind of secularism is more pervasive today than the new atheists who want to argue with you about God.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I mean, that's actually, you got a foothold there. You got a place to begin.
Yes.
With this natural irreligion sort of secularism, that's a very serious challenge for the church. And so in a sense, the kind of pre-evangelization work that needs to be done is to revive the religious dimension, is to make these questions again. Right.
So it's almost like the culture is becoming more and more anesthetized to
Exactly.
the question of meaning or relevance or religion at all.
Exactly.
So there's a real challenge in how do we wake up someone who is under anesthesia.
Exactly.
Really,
and if you just have a sort of scientific, materialistic outlook that says, what is good is what feels good, right? Like increasing my sense of vitality, then you end up with religion as a kind of drug, right?
The open to the people.
Right.
Right.
And maybe it's a drug that works for you, Father Ambrose, but it's not really a drug that works for me.
Right.
And I mean, this is sort of the ultimate form of blasphemy, in a sense, because it instrumentalizes religion, and completely distorts what religion is about. You shouldn't live the life you're living simply because it increases your sense of, subjective well-being, or your vital sense.
If it's merely a self-serving choice for one's life,
exactly,
then it's just simply that it's a selfish choice. And in fact, it isn't touching on the truth, or
Precisely.
It's not living in the truth of Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
Right?
So you should only believe in the Catholic faith because you come to the conviction that it is true, right? And the great apologists of the 20th century, I think about C.S. Lewis, is very, very good on this point, right? Flannery O'Connor's remark that if the Eucharist is just a symbol, then to hell with it, right? It's just kind of shocking,
like she would be,
but making the point that the only reason to believe something is because you're convinced that it's true, not because kind of it makes you feel good,
or it's serving some other purpose,
some other instrumental purpose
right.
for you. So the religion is a kind of whatever drug. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, whatever. That form of secularism, I think, is actually harder to contend with.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, it's an interesting question then, sort of what do folks like us, you in the secular world out there living your faith in the midst of all of these challenges and fighting the battles that you're fighting, or someone like me inside a monastery, inside the institutional church in this very, very ministerial way.
Yeah.
How do we confront this challenge of reawakening the religious dimension in a culture that is anesthetized to it? It's a very difficult question. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, it's a hard question. Aristotle, Metaphysics 1:1, all men by nature desire to know. So there isn't, all of us have
It's built in.
a built-in intellectual appetite for the truth. Ultimately, these various drugs, and I use that word very broadly, these various anesthetizing agents that we employ in the culture, from social media addiction to things that are even more harmful, don't satisfy the deepest longings, don't satisfy that, Augustine's restless heart that will only rest when it comes to know its origin and source.
Yes.
And so I think we begin by reawakening people's desire for the truth. The beautiful thing about the rational co-pursuit of the truth is that, as opposed to ideologies that can only advance by force, is that the truth compels without being coercive, right? The truth compels while at the same time respecting our freedom. So when you come to see the truth that 2 + 2 is 4, you can't not accept it, but you don't feel strong-armed or bullied into accepting it.
You weren't forced into it,
right?
It's that aha, right?
It's the aha. It's the light of the intellect.
Yes, I
right?
see that. We say, I see that.
Precisely. And in the moral realm, it's the light of the conscience, which is that aspect of us that participates in the logos, in the pursuit of truth and coming to see what is good. And I think to most normal people, right, a pursuit of truth that compels without coercing, that respects our freedom, is much more fulfilling and attractive than a society that bullies us into accepting this or that, by the coercive power of force or information control or manipulation or propaganda or censorship. I mean, I don't know any American of any political persuasion, left or right, who wants to be subjected to this form of, quite frankly, mind control.
Right. It's funny because it seems like there's a good number of people, and certainly we live in a little bit of a privileged corner of the society, don't we, Aaron? I mean, we're believing Catholic men who try to read good things and talk about, have good conversations and cultivate community around us, right? I mean, we're very, very blessed, you and I both,
right.
And so I don't know if it's because of that kind of position from God's immense blessings that we can wake up at a certain point, 2 weeks into the government lockdown, after the fear goes away, okay, like maybe this really is a life-threatening world, and or this particular threat is really like dangerous. We got to figure it out. Once you wake up to the fact that no, in fact, it's not, and we're being subjected to some real manipulation. Yeah. And it's that moment of, okay, this is not all right. Like what's happening around us is not all right. So we're able to do that, I think, because God has blessed us with this thirst for the truth. And a lot of people we know have that thirst for the truth, and they're blessed like that. What about everybody else who are still under the anesthesia, and the jackboots are coming, or they've already come, figuratively speaking, of course, or not so figuratively speaking sometimes. The prison bars are starting to close in. How do we help them? How does the truth of the gospel and the witness of religious life, the witness of faithful Catholic life, how does it help to get people to ask the right questions before it's too late?
It's interesting. I've thought a lot about this question. I've thought a lot about the interesting cross-section of people in the medical freedom movement, or the people who woke up early against the COVID authoritarianism. They're hard to classify politically. I mean, cuts across political spectrums. There's certainly a preponderance of people of faith, I would say. And one of the reasons for that is precisely if you believe in a transcendent source of truth, you are, I think, better able to critique the authority or the raw exercise of power of human sources of
Yes.
supposed authority, right? So, I mean, if you don't believe in a transcendent source of truth, you have to look to some authority to help guide your life, because we can't figure everything out on our own. Most of what we know, we take, so to speak, on faith.
Absolutely.
Right? On the word of other people that we take to be trustworthy. We don't run all the scientific experiments
Right.
to establish what we know scientifically. We can't do all that work personally. So we have to take much of what we know on authority of people that we deem to be trustworthy. Well, if you don't have a transcendent source of authority, your highest authority is going to be some human authority. And it's a really hard question to know how to critique that human authority. With that said, there are atheists. I have very dear friends who are atheists of goodwill within that movement too, that are concerned about these trends toward authoritarianism. But even among them, many of them are revisiting some of these deeper questions that are transcendent. And the example of my friend Naomi Wolf, who was a secular Jew, very left-leaning, was instrumental in Hillary Clinton's campaign, who it was the experience of evil that she observed around her during COVID that caused her, and she's described this publicly in interviews, saying, I started going back and reading the Old Testament prophets to try to understand
like, why is this happening?
Why is this happening? And and she's talking about transcendent demonic forces at work.
Yes.
And I mean, this is, and she, there's a lot of people like that who now feel not just politically homeless, but sort of philosophically and religiously, they're starting to ask some of these deeper questions. So it can be a range of things, from the personal experience of evil, the personal experience of force and coercion, that I think all human beings naturally rebel against, because God created us with an intellect and free will in order to freely come to know Him and come to know the truths in the world and to pursue them freely. And so when that is violated for individuals at a personal level, I think they feel the force of that in ways that, public debates or political debates, they may not find that
not
as
so compelling,
persuasive. But I sense that there's a lot of people in society that just have the gut feeling that something's wrong.
Right.
And something's wrong in the political order, something's wrong in the economic order, something's wrong in the general social order. And they may not be able to put their finger on it, but I think there's a lot of people now that are open to asking deeper question about starting from what's going on in society to maybe walking back to, well, what's going on in terms of my personal convictions, and how have I maybe participated in certain political or social ideologies that have actually contributed to getting us to the point where this is now a society that I no longer want to live in, and this is not the kind of future that I want my children to live in. What's going on with K through 12 education is a great example of that.
Some great pushback right now.
A lot of pushback.
Yes. Although I wish I would have seen more pushback as far as some of the government incursions in the whole pandemic lockdown nonsense. I mean, I don't know that that's going to happen again, but I have my doubts. The thing is, people are very manipulable, if that's a word, by forces outside of them, alas. So
they are. And propaganda is very powerful. I mean, that's why this free speech battle is so important. Not just to push back on censorship, but also, and we didn't talk about this much today, but also to get a handle on the state-sponsored propaganda that we've been subjected to.
Yes.
Because, I think if we don't get that right, it's game over.
Yes, right. Yeah.
I mean, if people can't have the freedom in the public square to pursue rational and reasonable inquiries and to ask questions and to challenge conventional thinking, we are inevitably headed in totalitarian directions.
Yes. Well, which is why your work is so important, Aaron. So we could go on for. I hope we do this again, because this is really, really enjoyable, and we've just kind of scratched the surface. So you've got a project underway, speaking of Augusto Del Noce,
Yes.
the great Italian philosopher. You're working on some elaboration of those thoughts in another book. Is that right?
I do. I have a book in the pipeline trying to introduce English-speaking readers to Augusto Del Noce, who I mentioned earlier. He's an Italian philosopher who lived through the 20th century rise of fascism in his own native Italy, and was very concerned about the problem of violence, in the 1930s. And then in the post-war years, looking at how 19th century ideologies and philosophies of history from Hegel and Marx played out in the historical circumstances of the 20th century. And so I think he's a very important thinker for our time.
Yes, he saw how there was the playbook, as it were, from the 19th century of Hegel and Marx, played out then in a devastating, horrible, globally catastrophic way in the 20th century.
Exactly.
But he's also prophetic in that sense, in his own way, looking ahead to the times that we're living in right now. I think that he looked
100%.
We find ourselves in living what this particular Italian philosopher wrote about over 50 years ago.
Yeah, he wrote a lot about the affluent technological society, which for him was not a society characterized by science and technology, but a society characterized by this instrumental view of reason and this view that the totalitarian conception of scientism, which is the view that science is the only valid form of knowledge and all other moral, religious, philosophical forms of inquiry are just purely nonsense. Right, and he called this totalitarian precisely because it
closes the cage, right?
Closes the cage and monopolizes what counts as science, and it allows for the weaponization of science because science is a set of methods. It's an open-ended inquiry
with truth as its goal.
Exactly,
with the logos actually as the top of that pursuit.
Precisely, but with scientism, you get you get follow the science. You get some politician anointing one particular individual or one particular institution as speaking for, capital T, capital S, the science that cannot be challenged, that cannot be questioned, which is a total distortion of the scientific enterprise, which is about hypothesis and testing and refutation and debate and ongoing
peer review and everything else. Yes.
So Augusto Del Noce was very far-seeing in this regard, not just in terms of what happened in the Soviet East and the other disasters of the 20th century totalitarianisms, but also what we see now playing out in the West, in the affluent technocratic society characterized by scientism and eroticism and a theology of secularization. These three components that he thought were intertwined. So this is. Del Noce is not necessarily easy to read. He writes mostly essays, but he often refers to Italian philosophers that Americans,
the English-speaking world is not so
never heard of, and he can be a little bit challenging for non-philosophers to follow. So this work, which I'm calling the title is "Light in the Twilight," on the thought of Del Noce, is an attempt to introduce English-speaking readers to his work, and that hopefully they'll go from there to the translations by my friend Carlo Lancelotti of Del Noce's work. There's 3 books of his that are now available in English.
Great. So, well, thanks for all of these worlds all these battlefronts that you're fighting on, Aaron, because it's fun to see someone like you doing these things. It's really encouraging for us who live, the kind of life that we religious priests live. It's beautiful to see this. So I hope we can be collaborative in this, not just in conversations like this, but by building each other up and building up the kingdom.
Indeed.
In pursuit of the truth. So
Indeed.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.